The first sound came on the wind, thin as a cracked bell and almost swallowed by the wide-open Texas night. Caleb Hart stopped his horse at the edge of the arroyo, the moon hanging low like a silver coin pinned to the sky. He had been riding home later than usual, the cattle finally settled, his bones tired in a way that came from years of dust and quiet. At first, he thought the sound was a trick of memory, his mind reaching for something it had no right to remember. Then it came again, a whisper, a breath, a word so small it barely existed, "Mama." Caleb's chest tightened, he swung down from the saddle, boots crunching over gravel, and listened with the kind of stillness only men who had spent their lives with animals could manage. The night smelled of sage and cold water. Coyotes yipped far away, and the arroyo cut a dark line through the land like an old scar. He waited, counting his breaths, telling himself not to be foolish. Babies didn't cry out here, not anymore, not since his wife had died 7 winters back, leaving behind a silence that had grown teeth. "Mama." The sound came again, closer this time, and Caleb felt it hit him not in the ears but in the ribs. He followed it down the slope, careful not to slip, and saw the sack wedged between stones where floodwater had once rushed. Burlap, tied with baling twine. Something inside it moved. He dropped to his knees, hands shaking as he cut the twine with his pocket knife. The sack fell open, and there, wrapped in a faded dress that smelled of old soap and fear, was a baby girl. Her cheeks were smudged with dirt, her lips blue from cold, her eyes barely open. She looked at him like she had been waiting all her life for this one moment. Her mouth trembled, and again she breathed the word like a prayer she didn't understand. "Mama." Caleb made a sound that surprised him, half a sob, half a laugh, and scooped her up against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, like the world had tried to forget her already. He tucked her into his coat, feeling her heart flutter against his own, and mounted his horse with care. As he rode, the moon slid behind clouds, and the land seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew something had just changed. The Hart Ranch house sat alone on a rise, its windows dark, except for the lamp Caleb always left burning in the kitchen. He carried the baby inside, set her down on the table, and stared at her as though she might vanish if he blinked. He had no crib, no bottles, no idea what to do next. He had hands built for rope and reins, not for miracles. The baby's cry had softened to a whimper, her eyes drifting shut and open again, as if sleep were a place she didn't trust. Caleb boiled water, remembered something about clean cloths, and found an old flannel shirt that had once belonged to his wife, Anna. The memory hit him like a sudden store. Manna laughing as she hung laundry, Anna singing off, ghee while stirring beans, Anna's hands warm and sure. He pressed his lips together and worked carefully, cleaning the baby's face, warming her with the flannel. When he laid her against his shoulder, she made a small sound and went quiet, her breath evening out. He stood there for a long time, afraid to move, afraid to think. By morning, the news traveled the way it always did in small towns, by coffee cups and porch steps, and the soft hum of gossip that pretended to be concern. Caleb drove into town with the baby bundled in a borrowed blanket, his hat pulled low. He stopped at the general store, where Mrs. Bell ran the counter with iron kindness, and asked for milk, diapers, anything she thought he'd need. She took one look at the bundle, then at Caleb's face, and her eyes softened. "Where'd you find her?" she asked. "Arroyo," Caleb said, "in a sack." Mrs. Bell made a sound like she'd bitten into something bitter. "People can be cruel," she said, and rang him up without another word. By noon the sheriff knew, and by evening so did the preacher. There were questions, of course, and promises to look into it, but no one seemed surprised. Hard times had a way of teaching people terrible lessons. Caleb named her Grace because the word kept showing up in his mind like a stubborn weed, pushing through cracks. He told himself it was temporary, that the law would take over, that someone else, someone better, would raise her. But nights came and mornings followed, and Grace stayed. She slept curled against his chest, her fingers fisted in his shirt, and when she cried, it was as if she were calling him back to himself. The first time she said it again, she was older, nearly 2, hair sticking up in soft curls, dirt smudged on her knees. Caleb was fixing a fence when he heard her voice drift across the yard. "Mama," she called, toddling toward him with fierce determination. He froze, the hammer slipping from his hand. He looked around stupidly, as if Anna might step out from behind the barn, smiling. Grace reached him and wrapped her arms around his leg, beaming. "Mama," she repeated, pleased with herself. Caleb knelt and gathered her up, tears burning his eyes. "I ain't your mama," he whispered, his voice breaking. Grace laughed and patted his cheek like she knew better. From that day on, the word stuck, and Caleb learned that names had a way of finding the truth before people did. Not everyone approved. There were whispers at church, sideways looks at the cafe. A single man raising a child wasn't common, and some folks liked their judgments neat and sharp. But there were others, too, neighbors who dropped off casseroles, women who taught him how to braid hair, old men who tipped their hats and said nothing at all. Grace grew like wildflowers, stubborn and bright, her laughter filling the spaces Caleb had boarded shut. Years passed, and the land changed its clothes, green in spring, gold in summer, bare in winter. Grace learned to ride before she learned to read, her legs clamped tight around the saddle, her grin wide as the sky. She asked questions that stopped Caleb in his tracks. Why do stars burn? Why did her mama leave her? Why did people do bad things? Caleb answered the ones he could and held her for the rest. On the 10th anniversary of the night he found her, a woman came to the ranch. She stood at the gate like she might bolt, her hair pulled back tight, her hands shaking. Caleb watched from the porch, Grace peeking out behind him, her eyes curious. The woman's voice trembled when she spoke. I heard you had a girl, found her." Caleb's jaw set. "What do you want?" The woman swallowed. "I think she's mine." The world narrowed to a thin line. Grace stepped forward, her hand slipping into Caleb's. "Who are you?" she asked. The woman's eyes filled. I'm the one who made a terrible mistake," she said. "I was young, I was scared, I thought she'd be better off." Caleb felt a rage rise in him, hot and sharp, but Grace's grip tightened, anchoring him. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I hear her voice every night." The woman whispered, "Because I can't sleep, because I want to make it right." They sat at the table, the air heavy with things unsaid. Grace listened, her face serious in a way that made Caleb ache. When it was over, the law got involved and papers were signed, and the woman left with nothing but tears and apologies. Grace stayed. She climbed into Caleb's lap that night and rested her head against his chest. "You're my mama," she said softly, as if sealing a promise. Years later, when Grace stood at the edge of that same arroyo, grown and strong, she remembered the story the way it had been told to her, softened by time, sharpened by love. She knew what had been done to her, and she knew what had been given back. Caleb stood beside her, older now, his hair silvered, his hands still sure. The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere far off a coyote called. Grace took a breath and smiled. "Funny," she said, "how one tiny word can change everything." Caleb nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Ain't nothing small about it," he said, and the land, wide and patient, seemed to agree.